Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this discussion on exotic Jewish communities around the globe. Two caveats right now before we start. The first is that this is not a history class. My goal over here is not to bore you with 1,000,001 facts, starting exactly 4,321 years ago, and then moving along to 4,320 years ago, and year by year to give you a rendition of births and deaths and all the rest. No. I see the Jewish experience as ongoing. To me, the passion that infused events 3,000 years ago is a passion that not only lives on like a battery might live on because it hasn't yet died, but it is the same passion that lives within the Jewish world today. There is a discussion taking place between the Jews alive today, the Jews that are not yet born, that will be alive in the future, and those of ancient times. And events do not seem to be confined to any one particular place and time in Jewish history, but each event, happening, and experience is interconnected with the other, and therefore based on this holistic view of Jewish history. And maybe I should really drop the word history and say the Jewish experience. Based on this view of the Jewish experience, I oftentimes will jump from one period of time and from one geographical location to another, sometimes drawing distinctions, sometimes connecting the two with similarities, but I view the Jewish experience as one whole, being shared by the Jews of old, by the Jews of today, and by the Jews of tomorrow. The second thing I should let you know is that occasionally I'm going to be talking pretty fast because I want to fill in as many details as possible. My goal here is to provide for you as complete a picture as I possibly can cram into 10 CDs, such that you will no longer be reliant upon others for information on these subjects, and that you can take much of the information that you've learned and continue with your own research and take it in whatever direction you decide to take it. And without further ado, we begin. Vayhi bimei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh, hamolech mehodu viad kush, sheva ve'esrimu meya medina. Ma lo yadatem sheze b'ivrit. And it was in the days of Ahasuerus. Thus begins the book of Esther. It was in the days of Ahasuerus, probably referring to Chayarsha, known also as Xerxes, although we can't be certain this is the guy we're talking about. But it was in the days of Ahasuerus that the story takes place. Ahasuerus, the Bible tells us in this first verse in the book of Esther, ruled from Hodu until Kush, from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. Later, the wicked visor to the king, a man by the name of Haman, whose name is much disliked among the Jews of the world today, Haman tells the king, Yeshno am echad. Although it's unlikely that Haman spoke Hebrew, we can assume this is a pretty accurate translation. Yeshno am echad mefuzar u'meforad bein ha'amim bechol medinot malchutecha. There is this one nation, you can guess who he's talking about. There is this one nation that is scattered and divided throughout all of the provinces in your kingdom. Throughout all the provinces in his kingdom, 2,500 years ago there were Jews scattered from India to Ethiopia. Well, maybe. We're not entirely sure that this mention of Hodu and Kush refers to India and Ethiopia. It could be that Hodu and Kush refer to other places, particularly because we don't think Chayarsha ruled from India to Ethiopia. But whatever the case might be, this goes to show that certainly even in ancient times, the Jews were scattered throughout many different kingdoms. They were scattered throughout many countries and many lands, and that continued up until the modern times. Well, that continues actually up until this very day, when Jews are scattered throughout the entire globe, except for a few countries that stand strong in their disallowing any Jews through their borders, unless, of course, the Jews are part of the American personnel trying to help out in various Middle Eastern lands. But whatever the case might be, we are going to be talking in this series of talks on Jewish communities around the globe about Jewish communities in China throughout the years, from olden times until modern times, about a number of Jewish communities in India that we'll be starting on in just a moment here in this lecture, about early Egyptian Jewry and various temples that Jews had in Egypt, about early Yemenite Jewry, very, very interestingly, about the 10 lost tribes, more, how can I find a good word? Something we can broadcast on the radio maybe. more junk, we can say junk, more junk has been said about the 10 lost tribes than about most matters relating to the Jewish people. And trust me, a lot of junk has been said about many different Jewish topics. But the 10 lost tribes will try to be as accurate as possible while sharing with you some of the more controversial theories as well relating to the 10 lost tribes. Naturally, we'll give you an entire background picture as to who these 10 lost tribes are that you've probably heard of and perhaps even seen silly documentaries of. We're going to be talking about a kingdom of converts in what is today's southwestern Russia. Really fascinating stuff. Sounds like the kind of thing that often is not true. Sounds like some of the claims made about Jews that often are not the case and that are just believed by people who will believe anything, but in fact it actually took place, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about early Babylonian Jewry throughout some of the, over the course of maybe 1,500 years. We're going to talk about the Jewish world during the time of the Second Temple and the fall of Masada. We're going to discuss the relationship between the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims in various times in various lands. We're going to talk very excitingly about a number of heretical Jewish sects that broke off in olden times and continue amazingly to hold on and exist until this very day, all in all covering about 3,500 years up until today and going forth until tomorrow. One more verse from the Bible before we go on, and this is from Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, where Moses speaks in the name of God, saying, Im yihiyeh nidachacha b'ktzei hashamayim, if your scattered one shall be at the edge of the heavens, then misham yikabetzcha Adonai Elohecha, umisham yikachecha. Then from there will God gather you, and from there will God take you. And then afterwards, the Bible goes on to say, God will bring you back to the land of your forefathers, and you shall inherit that land. Now, say what you will about the Bible, and certainly there are plenty of people, I'm sure, listening to this cassette CD, perhaps pirated. Please don't pirate this, I got to make a living, man. But there are plenty of people listening who have different points of view regarding the Bible. But the facts remain that the only people prophesied about in ancient times that they'd be scattered throughout the globe and yet would return to their land, and that actually took place thousands of years later, were the Jews. So, say what you will, this prophecy did come true, but as Zionistic as I happen to be, I'm not going to focus on the miracle of the ingathering of the exiles, because, for 2 reasons. First of all, some of these communities didn't make it. My focus here is on exotic Jewish communities around the globe. I'm going to talk about the diaspora mostly. We're going to talk a little bit about the land of Israel too. Mostly about the diaspora, and regardless of how they related to the ingathering of the exiles, for example, some of these communities didn't manage to make it back to Israel. Regardless of the relationship with the land of Israel, we're going to talk about these communities, and they're worthwhile to discuss in their own right. And secondly, we won't get too Zionistic, because I am not one of those who believes with a religious belief that the state of Israel shall not be destroyed. It seems to me that if you look at the state of Israel today, as glorious and wonderful as it is, and I certainly am one of those who sees it as the most wonderful thing happening in the Jewish world today, and that has happened in the Jewish world in quite some time, but nevertheless there is no promise, no guarantee, politically, religiously, or any otherwise, that the state of Israel will not crumble. As a matter of fact, it seems, looking from a realistic viewpoint, and this is unhappy news, I'm sorry to break it to you, but it seems very realistically the state of Israel will fall, my friends. And I'm not talking because of the various small-time cockroach terrorists that blow up buses. The Jews are stronger than that. And although, of course, it's devastating anytime even the smallest terror attack takes place, it's not sufficient to destroy the state of Israel. What will destroy the state of Israel is the Jewish conscience. The Jewish conscience that refuses to look at the fact that 1/4 of all children, 1/4 of all Israeli children with Israeli passports who will vote, mind you, 1/4 of all Israeli children are Arabs. That's right, they are Arab Israelis, and they are not voting for a Jewish state. So what is taking place now in the Arab world is a 2-pronged attack. The first form of attack, of course, is physical. There's always been some nation in this world at every given point. No, not only was one nation planning to destroy the Jewish people, but in every generation there is a group of people that plan to destroy the Jews and that try to kill as many Jews as possible. So of course that is one of the great joys of our Muslim fanatical friends. But in addition, they are destroying Israel from the inside by promoting a very, very high birth rate among Arab Israelis. And Jews in Israel, except for the fanatical fringe, who unfortunately oftentimes don't speak in the most eloquent manner. Some do, but many don't, and many are the fanatical fringe. Jews in Israel aren't discussing the fact that the Arab Israelis will destroy the state of Israel within the next 50 years, guaranteed, and the possibility of perhaps offering some sort of incentive for them to leave to the rest of the Middle East, which is rather vast compared to the tiny pin-sized Israel within the Islamic world. But that's not our focus here. I just want to point out to you why we're not overly Zionistic. Our point relates to the Jews. The state of Israel hopefully will remain and will grow in strength and shall be around forever, but that is not the focus of our discussion, and we shall try not to be overly Zionistic and overly optimistic, because it is best to be a little bit more realistic, just in case our highest hopes don't come to fruition. Now, before kicking into discussing the Jews of India in particular, let's talk a bit about exotic Jewish communities around the globe in general. The first thing you should know is that there is a tribe of people in this world. I've discovered them early on, and it seems that they only grow in numbers and in strength. There is a tribe of people in this world who will believe anything they are told as long as it is strange and unlikely. And they have spoken much, as I said, regarding exotic Jewish communities around the globe. They have opened websites, they have written books, and they have started organizations and made documentaries. And most of the strange stuff, I believe, that they've propagated was in error. I don't think that people necessarily had agendas, but occasionally people do have agendas. They want to sell their documentary, or they have their various religious proofs that they have to point out, whether we're talking about Jewish religious, whether we're talking about Christian religious, and generally speaking, it is those two religious groups that point out very strange claims regarding the lost tribes and regarding exotic Jewish communities. We're going to point some of those out through the course of our discussion on the communities, but in general, you should know that not everything you're going to read or hear on the subject is going to be accurate. Hey, everybody makes mistakes. Everybody is human. But there are some books and websites that are comprised almost entirely of mistaken and incorrect information. Now, you should know as well that this is not just a modern phenomenon. People were as naive, perhaps more naive in olden times than they are in modern times. And because there was no internet and because the world was a much larger place in pre-modern times, even some of the most scientific minds made some of the most ridiculous claims regarding exotic communities in pre-modern times. Now, to give you one fine example, the important Christian king Prester John of Ethiopia, who was highly regarded by Christendom and was well thought of and well spoken of, unfortunately never existed. Nevertheless, important political moves took place in Europe, and there is a large body of literature relating to Prester John, despite the fact that, as mentioned, he in fact never existed. As well, you should realize that just because a group of Jews may have lived in some country, we'll pick a country arbitrarily, say the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, commonly known to us infidel Westerners as North Korea. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, no relation to the Democratic Republic of Congo, very democratic societies. Of course, there have been spoken of Jews in ancient times in North Korea because every country on the face of this earth has had a claim of a Jewish community in pre-modern times. But of course, regarding North Korea, the odds are extremely slight that it was the case. But even say that there was a report of a Jewish community in North Korea, and it was correct. And in fact, there were Jews in North Korea, and today there's a group of North Koreans saying, hey, we're Jews. Don't worry, there are no groups of North Koreans today saying, hey, we're Jews. But, so to speak, say there was. A group of North Koreans say, we descend from those people. It could even be that there were a group of Jews living in North Korea, and nevertheless they have no relationship with this modern people in North Korea claiming that they descend from those Jews. You should recognize, just because we may have even rock-hard evidence of Jews in a particular land, does not necessarily mean that claims to Jewishness made by a tribe in that land today have any validity because of this older claim. To give you an example, we're going to be talking now about India, which we're going to be discussing, has 4 distinct Jewish communities, 7 castes in total, but 4 communities. And 2 of the communities that we'll be talking about, the first 2 are very clearly Jewish communities, and they're very clearly Jewish communities from antiquity. Nevertheless, until modern times, they did not know of each other. And you might wonder, considering that they're in the same country and on the same western coast, how it's possible they could not know of each other. So I'd like to point out to you that in India, even if there were 1,000 Jewish communities, and each of these 1,000 Jewish communities had 10,000 members, nevertheless, they would only make up 1% of the population of India. That's right, if there were 1,000 communities with 10,000 members each, they would still make up only 1% and perhaps not even know each other. So reports of Jews in a particular region does not necessarily mean any connection between one group and another. In addition, so far as genetics are concerned, we're going to talk a little bit about recent genetic research. You should recognize, first of all, that some of the genetic research that's been done, and this is a very new scientific field, some of the research that was done has been done somewhat sloppily. They've been done through the web, where people are asked anonymously to rub something against the inside of their cheek and to send it away and answer all different sorts of questions as to where their parents and grandparents are from, but there is no independent verification as to whether the people involved are answering these questions correctly. And even in cases where the research is done properly and is done responsibly, nevertheless, the research is very, very complex. There is a wide variety of opinions among experts, and generally speaking, what gets filtered down to us laymen has been filtered down through the lenses of journalists, who are most interested in writing an interesting article and in selling newspapers. And therefore, I remember particularly one intensive study that was done on various Jewish communities around the globe that was reported in 2 such amazingly different manners by 2 different Jewish papers, each one trying to prove their own separate point. One newspaper headlined that the Jews and the Palestinians descend from the same ancestors. Obviously, they had a particular political point to make with this claim. And the other, based on the same research, said that all Jews are closely related and that they did not accept a great many converts through the years. And obviously, they had a different point that they wanted to push. The truth of the matter in this nuanced study was that Jews, generally speaking, aside for a few communities, were shown to be very closely related on their father's side. The mother's side is more debated, but on their father's side, there's been only a small amount of conversion into the community, and it was shown, therefore, that the majority of Jews who do come recently from Europe, the majority of Jews are more closely related to Middle Easterners than they are related to Europeans. But even in the Middle East, they are more closely related to the Kurds and Armenians than they are to Arabs, including Palestinians. Nevertheless, they are more closely related to Palestinians than they are to Europeans, and therefore, based on this research, of course, there's much more to say on the matter, but we've got to move forward. Based on this research, you had these 2 different articles written. So always remember, when reading articles on genetic studies relating to exotic Jewish communities or relating to any matters of anthropology, that what you're reading may be only the sensationalist claim of the research, and you may not be getting the full picture or even the sensational claim within its proper context. Okay, moving along to India. Recently in India, a fellow died a few months ago. A man by the name of Nissim Ezekiel passed away from Alzheimer's disease. Nissim Ezekiel was known in India as the greatest writer, generally considered the greatest writer in the English language, at least the greatest Indian poet writing in the English language. Of course, in India, there's a wide variety of languages and a wide variety of names, but very few languages produce names that sound like Nissim Ezekiel. He was an interesting fellow, and it was known by people throughout India that he came from the Teli caste, the caste of oilmen. But his people were called the Shanwar Teli, the Saturday oilmen, because they had the very strange custom of not working on Saturday. They were also known as the Bnei Israel. Amazingly, that's right, they were known as the sons of Israel, which is what Jews were called in ancient times, beginning in Genesis, until later on they came to be called Yehudim, from the tribe of Judah, and of course Jews. About this Bnei Israel, of course, they kept the Sabbath, hence Shanwar Teli. Although they only kept the Sabbath to the best of their ability, and the best of their knowledge was rather slim. Until a few hundred years ago, which we'll be discussing in just a moment, they also kept some of the holidays. They did not eat various animals and fish. Well, by the way, they didn't eat any beef because their neighbors didn't eat beef, the same reason why their widows did not remarry. but that relates to Indian customs, not to Jewish customs. They had a rudimentary understanding of kashrut, of the kosher laws. As well, they did circumcise males, which of course is the covenant between the Jewish people and God. And they ate cholent. No, they didn't eat cholent. But they had a chant. Their chant was, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. It seems that more or less these were the only Hebrew words they knew, aside for some of the names that they had in the community that were Hebrew names. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. They didn't know what these words meant, and they just repeated them as a mantra. They repeated them at all occasions. They knew from their parents and grandparents that had been passed down that this was the most important prayer. But until they were reconnected with the Jewish world, they did not even know what Shema Yisrael meant. They also have an interesting custom of Malida, which is unique to this community, and that is a celebration in honor of Elijah the prophet, when they would prepare fruit, rice, candy-type items, flowers. A frequent celebration. They claim that Elijah the prophet appeared twice to the community. Once when they first arrived on Indian shores, he helped to keep them alive, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. And the second time at Khandala near Alibag. And there is a stone where they claim you can still see a mark from where Elijah ascended to heaven on his fiery chariot. Sounds a little bit like what the Muslims have to say about the Haram al-Sharif, which is the beautiful aspect of anthropology. It often shows us some of the machinery lurking deep in the human mind that produces similar myths among different peoples. When did these Bnei Israel get to India? Some say they came during Solomon's time. Others say they came as part of the 10 lost tribes. But they claim that they're much more recently arrived in India. They claim they've only come during the time of Antiochus Theos Epiphanes. Antiochus, God manifest, as he humbly referred to himself. Antiochus Theos Epiphanes, who was a seriously Hellenistic Seleucidan ruler from Syria, and who was not a big fan of Judaism. As a matter of fact, the Jews were not much of a fan of his, and therefore Mattatyahu and his sons, including Judah the Maccabee, led a revolt against him. Many Jews sided with Antiochus, and these Jews in India claim, but this is a very tenuous claim, we're not entirely certain this to be the case. As a matter of fact, the evidence is slight. We don't quite know. This seems to be not much more than conjecture. But they claim there was a third option, and that was to sit out the fight. Not to side with Antiochus, not to side with Mattatyahu and the Hasmonean dynasty, but rather to leave. And so they claim that they left about 175 before the Common Era, and that they were traveling off the coast of India when their ship sunk. Their ship sunk, most people drowned, but 7 Jewish men and 7 Jewish women made it ashore at Nau-Gaon, and some other bodies washed ashore. And they buried the bodies there at Nau-Gaon, and that cemetery still stands. There are people from the community who still go to visit that cemetery and to pray there. In any event, this community was completely cut off from all other Jews until the 1700s, except they claim that in the 1100s, approximately, a fellow by the name of David Rahabi, or Rabbi David, shows up among their community and teaches them much Judaism that they did not know. And he appoints rabbis who are called Kajis, and the Kajis, as a hereditary position, teach the knowledge to their children and grandchildren, etc. 2 comments on this David Rahabi. The first is that we may know David Rahabi. You see, there was a great man who was born either in 1135 or 1138, it's not entirely clear, died in 1204, named Moses Maimonides, Abu Imran ibn Abdullah, as he's never actually referred to, but Moses Maimonides, Moses the son of Maimon. And he was a great philosopher and jurist. His works are studied every single day up until today, and it seems that they shall continue to be studied every day through many tomorrows. Moses Maimonides had a brother named David, who was an Indian trader, as many Jews in the Middle East were at that time, many successful Jews, and it seems that his brother David Maimonides drowned off the coast of India, perhaps off the west coast of India, not far from this community at Nau-Gaon. As a matter of fact, some would claim that maybe this David Rahabi was this David Maimonides. And it may be. But as tantalizing as that possibility is, as exciting, as much as it makes the imagination run wild, the odds are so small that this is the case, and the evidence is so slight that to believe it, one would have to be extraordinarily credulous. But hey, it is possible. The second matter relating to David Rahabi is that he did not necessarily exist, which certainly would throw at least a little bit of a monkey wrench into the David Maimonides theory. You see, there was a David Rahabi connected with the Kochini Jewish community that we'll talk about in a moment, that was connected with this community about 200 years ago. So it could be that the memory of the Bnei Israel sent this David Rahabi of 200 years ago off into the distant past of 900 years ago. Alternatively, they borrowed his name, perhaps with permission. They borrowed his name and they cut and pasted it and shipped it back to 900 years ago, when in fact some Jewish fellow from an Arabic land did actually come to their community and teach them about Judaism. Whatever the case might be, this is what they claim. So what do we actually know about these Jews in India? Well, we know there were Jews traveling to India even from the Talmud about 1500 years ago. Then we found many documents in the Cairo Geniza, which is an accidental archive in Egypt that I guess we'll discuss in greater depth at another time. But we found a number of documents in the Cairo Geniza relating to Jews traveling to India on trade. As well, we have the travelogue of Benjamin of Tudela about 800 years ago, who writes about the Jews of India. He writes there were 1,000 black Jews in India. Mind you, he never came to India as far as we know, but he heard about it from other people, and it seems that in this case, unlike in others where he reports what he heard, he was probably accurate. He also mentions Jews in Ceylon or Sri Lanka, which of course can't be, considering how distant it is from every other Jewish community, except for the fact that we recently found a letter in the Cairo Geniza relating to a Jewish fellow from Yemen who is doing trade with Ceylon. In any event, they were eventually reconnected, the Bnei Israel, with the rest of the Jewish world, amazingly enough in the 18th century, by Christian missionaries. You see, in a number of cases, Christian missionaries were not the best friends of Jews, at least from a Jewish perspective, and they did much to assimilate Jews out of the Jewish world and to make them Christians, for example, in China and in Ethiopia, which we shall be discussing. But the Christian missionaries in this case, dealing with the Bnei Israel, deserve a tremendous amount of credit, and they deserve a great amount of our gratitude for saving this community. Not for saving them by teaching them their beliefs, but for saving them by reconnecting them with their ancient heritage. And then in 1796, a member of the community, Samuel Ezekiel Divakar, Samuji in his native tongue, is fighting for the British against the forces of Tipu Sultan, and he as well as others are captured. And it was the happy custom of Mr. Sultan to behead the POWs that he captured. Apparently he was not up with the Geneva Convention, but his mother said that the Quran says good things about the Bnei Israel, and therefore please spare the life of this Bnei Israel fellow, Samuel Ezekiel Divakar. The Quran happens to say good and bad things about Jews, but happily for Mr. Samuji, Tipu Sultan's mom was more focused on the good things. And therefore, his life was saved. As well, the Kochini Jewish community did much to help save his life, particularly David Rahabi, the real David Rahabi, or at least one of the real David Rahabis. In gratitude to God, Mr. Divakar builds the Shar HaRachamim synagogue, the Gates of Mercy synagogue, the first synagogue this community have had in thousands of years, as far as we know. Built in 1796, it is still in use today, and nearby is Samuel Street in honor of Samuel Ezekiel Divakar. Interestingly, this community had no custom to fast on the 9th day of the month of Av, commemorating the destruction of both temples, because they did not know that the temple was destroyed, probably because they left while the temple still stood, possibly, as they claim, during the Maccabean revolt. They also did not celebrate Hanukkah, probably because they left before Hanukkah was instituted as a holiday, which would also fit nicely with their leaving at the start of the oppressive rule of Antiochus Epiphanes. A bit more modern than Antiochus Epiphanes, the Bnei Israel were divided into two castes. There were the Gora Israel and the Kala Israel. The Gora Israel were those who claimed that they had never intermarried with locals and remained true to their ancient heritage and only intermarried with each other. And the Kala Israel were those who they claimed had at one point intermarried with locals, and they did not intermarry between the two groups, the Gora Israel and Kala Israel, until modern times. In modern times they did intermarry and they became one people. Interestingly, by the way, we mentioned genetics. Genetically, many of you may have heard of the Kohen gene. That is a particular genetic haplotype that is found among about half of Kohanim, about half of the people who claim that they descend from the ancient priests of old, descending originally from Aaron, the high priest brother of Moses. There is naturally some debate regarding the Kohen gene, but what is truly fascinating is that a large number of the Bnei Israel have the Kohen gene. thus not exactly proving that they descend from Jews. You should recall, by the way, that a group in southernmost Africa, the Lemba tribe, have to a large degree this Kohen gene, as it's generally referred to, which may of course mean that there was some hapless Kohen from Yemen who drifted downstream and ended up off the southeastern coast of Africa and sired the male ancestors of the Lemba tribe. But whatever the case might be, like I said, the research is still somewhat debated and somewhat unclear, and there are plenty of non-Jews out there who do in fact descend from assimilated Jews. You should realize that tens of millions of Jews have assimilated over the course of the millennia, and therefore you are going to have hundreds of millions of people around the world at the very least who have some quote-unquote Jewish genes among them. But whatever the case might be, the Bnei Israel have retained their Jewish identity, and many of them have this Kohen gene. The reconnection with Indian Jewry took place about 200 years ago, with world Jewry only about 100 years ago. At first, they were against Zionism. They wrote to Herzl that they preferred to wait for the miraculous divine hand. I bet Neturei Karta doesn't know that they have followers in India, but they preferred to wait for the divine hand. But eventually they came around, and most of the community moved to Israel in the 1950s. Like all Jewish communities, they had it rough in Israel in the early years. Every community had their distinct reason why it was rough. But the Bnei Israel in particular had a very rough time because there was a question regarding their Jewish status. And hundreds of them left their homes in Lud and other places and went to Jerusalem for a sit-in that lasted for a number of weeks, because many rabbis said that in order for a Bnei Israel to marry a non-Bnei Israel, research would have to be done into the Bnei Israel's lineage to make sure that his or her mother's mother's mother was in fact Jewish, because they admitted that there was intermarriage between the Gora Israel and Kala Israel, and according to their own claims, the Kala Israel were a blend between local Indians and between Jews. In any event, a number of kosher legalistic loopholes were found, and the controversy subsided, and today in Israel there is no difficulty between a Bnei Israel marrying a Jew who is non-Bnei Israel. And recently in the city of Holon in Israel, when a rabbi said that he would not perform the ceremony between a Bnei Israel and non-Bnei Israel if the Bnei Israel did not undergo a just-in-case conversion, he was threatened by the chief rabbinate that he would lose his license to practice as a rabbi in Israel if he did not perform this marriage. And I think that regardless of the merits of the case, that is an unfair way to deal with a rabbi who should have his own autonomy when dealing with matters of Jewish law. Whatever the case might be, that is the fact, that the Bnei Israel are accepted completely and absolutely as Jews, as much as all other Jews in Israel. Today there's about 50,000 Bnei Israel and descendants of Bnei Israel in Israel, the state of Israel, and about 4,000 left in India, most still along the northwestern coast, but there are many scattered throughout all of India, and some have gone abroad and left India for other parts of the Jewish world, and there is even a small community of Bnei Israel, I don't even know if we can call them a community, but a number of Bnei Israel in exotic San Francisco. Those Bnei Israel who remained in India have a very low rate of intermarriage and assimilation, and generally speaking, they've done quite well for themselves. As a matter of fact, a number of Bnei Israel have won the very prestigious Indian Padma Shri Prize, including Dr. Jerusha Jacob Girard, who is a woman, by the way, actor David Abraham Cherulkar, Dr. Reuben David Dandekar, as well as a number of other Bnei Israel. The Bnei Israel, you realize, did very well under the British, because the British generally chose people like the Bnei Israel and the Sikhs and others who were not from the majority Indian clans, because they had less nationalistic sentiments, and the British always believed divide and conquer. But even post-British, the Bnei Israel did very well. I'll give you a few more examples. A fellow by the name of David Ezra Rubin was the Chief Justice of the Patna High Court. The brothers Bahadur Bapuji Israel and Shalom Bapuji Israel were administrators and governors in regions of India. And Gandhi, Mohandas K. Gandhi, or Mahatma Gandhi, if you're a fan, had quite a number of Jewish friends, including the Bnei Israel Dr. Erolkar, whose daughter, interestingly enough, is the First Lady of Cyprus, which seems to be a common Jewish position. Shlomo Musayev of the extremely interesting Musayev clan, the extremely interesting Musayev dynasty of millionaires from Bukhara, Israel, and London. His daughter is the First Lady of Iceland, and I'll cut off the Queen Esther motif before mentioning Monica Lewinsky. Well, too late. Finally, and perhaps most impressively among the Bnei Israel, is General J.F.R. Jacob, who oversaw the defeat of the Pakistani army and the liberation of Bangladesh. Later, he became the governor of Goa, and from 1999 to 2003, he was the governor of the entire Punjab region in India. So, if you're in a gas station in the United States, and you happen to see a fellow there with a somewhat Indian countenance behind the counter, and he has a turban and a beard, he is probably a Sikh. He also has long underwear, but you probably won't know that, at least hopefully won't know that. But if you recognize him by his turban and beard, you can ask him about the Jewish General J.F.R. Jacob, the governor of the Punjab region, and he's probably familiar with him. Interestingly enough, considering that most Jews have never heard of General J.F.R. Jacob. Remember that the Bnei Israel in India today make up less than 1,000th of 1% of the population. Less than 1,000th of 1% of the population. Nevertheless, they achieved rather high distinction in the country. Now, where did I leave my copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? On to the second Jewish community in India, that of David Rahabi, the Jewish community of Cochin, who were so instrumental in helping out Samuel Ezekiel Divakar, and by extension helping out the entire Jewish community of the Bnei Israel to reconnect with their ancient Jewish roots and with the rest of the Jewish world alive in their own day. The Jewish community of Cochin live, well, at least those who are still around there are very few left. As a matter of fact, almost the entire Jewish community, almost all 3,000 of them, ended up making their way to Israel. And so the Jewish community of Cochin in India, we cannot really say exists anymore. But there's about 5 or 6, and that's it, just about 5 or 6 of them still left in Cochin. The area where they did live in the Cochin, when this Jewish community existed, was called Jewtown. Now, I know that sounds like the kind of thing that you'd expect Jesse Jackson to say on a presidential campaign, but it is so. Jewtown, Cochin, on the southwestern coast of India. They used to live a bit north of that in Cranganore. They moved to Cochin after some unhappiness in Cranganore, firstly involving 2 Jewish brothers who apparently inherited a position. And I know you're going to find this strange, but there was some difficulty between these 2 Jewish brothers, and there may have even been a politically motivated murder involved in the community. And so the community did not do well in Cranganore. They moved southward down to Cochin. As well, they did not do very well when the Portuguese showed up. The Portuguese, like in Europe and South America, as well as the Spanish in Europe and South America, had the unfortunate habit of torturing and murdering and burning people at the stake if they were accused of backsliding out of Christianity. You see, there were conversos, people who converted to Christianity because of threats. Some of them didn't convert because of threats. Some converted because they wanted positions they could only have if they were Christians. But many converted because they were threatened with expulsion, and expulsion often meant death. And therefore, these people and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were made sure to be good Christians, these new Christians, or Marranos, as they are commonly known. And if any of them were accused of backsliding into Judaism, or as well this occurred with regard to the Islamic Moors too, but we're discussing the Jewish community at this point, if they were accused of backsliding and they did not confess, or alternatively, if they did confess and say, yes, in fact, I was Jewish and I do not regret it, then they were burnt alive at auto da fes, or acts of faith. And I know this is going to be a bit of a controversial thing to say, but the facts are that Christians today owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to secular humanists who forced Christians of old to retreat from some of the evil practices that were done in the name of Christianity and to take hold, perhaps to retake hold, of a humanistic religion. And one from whom I've learned much, a fellow who in fact at the end of his life became a Unitarian minister, a fellow by the name of Pierre van Passan. I highly recommend reading his books. His last name spelled Paassen, and I learned much about religion from this Christian minister, Pierre van Passan, particularly in the first chapter of a book of his called The Forgotten Ally. If you have the opportunity to read the first chapter of The Forgotten Ally by Pierre van Passan, I highly recommend it, and it will show what Christianity was probably originally meant to be, and what happily in many communities Christianity is today, but unfortunately what Christianity was not throughout much of its history, throughout much of the world. When and from where came these Jews of Cochin? Well, we don't exactly know. They have a claim that they came from Majorca, an island off the coast of Spain, in about the 4th century. We'll never know for sure because when the Portuguese showed up in India, they destroyed many of the records of the Jewish community. What we do know is that there is a tombstone nearby on the island of Chanamangalam, a Jewish tombstone from 1269. But as you'll see in a moment, we have evidence of Jews being there from even before 1269. Europeans only found out about this Jewish community in Cochin in about the 1500s, which was very much connected with the arrival of the Messiah in Europe, a fellow who actually denied that he was the Messiah. But of course, only a true Messiah would deny that he was the Messiah. This is David HaReuveni, David the Reubenite. David the Reubenite shows up and he says that he is on a political mission. He says that his brother is ruler over some of the 10 lost tribes and that he would like to forge an alliance with the Christian world in order to conquer Palestine from the infidel Islamic Turks. He claimed that he was from Chavor, mentioned in the Bible, where some of the 10 lost tribes went, and many Jews believed that in fact he was from Cochin. Amazingly enough, he was received with honors by Pope Clement VII, and Pope Clement VII gave him a letter to the King of Portugal. He shows up and is received as an ambassador by King John III of Portugal, and the Moranos in Portugal are ecstatic and are certain against his claims that he in fact is the Messiah. And a fellow by the name of Diogo Pires, a rising star, a young noble, this Diogo Pires, he openly says now that he is a Jew and that he will practice Judaism. He circumcises himself, almost killing himself in the process, and he takes the name Shlomo Molcho. And he goes around announcing that the Messiah's coming is at hand. Shlomo Molcho, unfortunately, did not merit to see the Messiah, for he, in fact, was burnt at the stake. But his name lived on, for example, among Rabbi Yosef Karo's writings. Rabbi Yosef Karo, in his Magid Meisharim, writes much about Shlomo Molcho, this man of God, and Rabbi Yosef Karo wanted as well, just like Shlomo Molcho, to be killed for his religion. That might sound like a strange desire, but when you have to go, you may as well go for a good cause. Unrelated to this were the copper plates that the Jewish community of Cochin had, which they claimed were extremely ancient, at least from the 4th century when they claimed they arrived, but it seems that the plates have recently been dated almost certainly to between the years of 974 and 1020. Recently, interestingly, a copy of these plates was given by the Prime Minister of India to the Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon. The original plates, however, were offered to Yosef Rabban and to his family. He was granted the area of Anjuvanam as long as the world and moon exist. He was also granted various tax benefits, and very importantly, he was allowed to have people walk before him blowing trumpets so as to clear away the lower castes, and most importantly, his family had the right to ride on elephants. The Jewish community of Cochin was divided into 3 castes. There were the black Jews, claiming they were the most ancient. There were the white Jews, claiming they were the most ancient. And there were the brown Jews, who never claimed they were the most ancient. The black Jews claimed that they were the earliest group of Jews to arrive at Cochin, but the white Jews were the ones who had these copper plates in their possession. Apparently, a few hundred years ago, the black Jews were the higher caste. But as more and more white Jews came to Cochin, it seems that the white Jews became the higher caste. In fact, a few hundred years ago, Jewish travelers to the region believed that the black Jews were descended from slaves of the white Jews. And when the slaves were freed, they became the caste of black Jews. That could be, because that brings us to the brown Jews. The brown Jews we know were descended from slaves, and they were treated as a very low caste. You know, back in the synagogue and all the rest, they were not allowed to participate in synagogue services, and they were very disgruntled by their situation. And therefore, one Saturday, they organized a sit-down on the road to the synagogue. They didn't let the other Jews pass. They said, "We descend from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." They meant it metaphorically, obviously. "We descend from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we are allowed to be complete Jews just like you. We demand to be allowed into the synagogue, and we'd like Maftir Yonah." Well, they didn't ask for Maftir Yonah, but they wanted to be in the synagogue and be allowed to be called up to the Torah and to hold the Torah. And they won! They did not allow the Jews to pass until they had their demands met, and they won, and they intermarried eventually with the rest of the Jews of Cochin, and all of the Jews of Cochin that I have spoken to in recent times deny that there ever was such a thing as the brown Jews, either because they descend from these brown Jews, alternatively because they are shamed by the fact that they once had this low caste among them and considered their brethren to be of low caste. But I would assume it's more so because the brown Jews have intermarried with the community and no one wants to be descended from slaves. I'm not quite sure why, because we Jews openly say that we descend from slaves, and anyone who has read the book of Exodus is familiar with this. Back to Yosef Rabban of the copper plates, it seems that he had his own little kingdom called Shingali or Shinkali. As a matter of fact, a reference from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi of Spain seems to make reference to this kingdom of Shingali. In any event, in 1498, Vasco da Gama, the well-known explorer, shows up in India, very well-known as an explorer, lesser well-known as an evil mass murderer and torturer who would cut people up into little pieces. He comes to India and he promptly arrests the individual sent out to greet him. The fellow sent out to greet him is a Jewish man, possibly named Yosef Adel, although not entirely certain. Yosef Adel seems to be a refugee from Poland who somehow made his way to Alexandria, where he was sold as a slave to India. Somehow he attains his freedom in India, works for the local ruler, and when Vasco da Gama shows up, the ruler says, "Hey, he's a European, you're a European, why don't you go out to meet this fellow?" And therefore Yosef Adel heads out. Vasco da Gama is not impressed. Vasco da Gama and his fellow Portuguese were not very impressed by these exotic Jewish communities of India. They would not buy this lecture series. And Vasco da Gama therefore kidnaps Yosef Adel, converts him forcibly to Christianity, renames him Gaspar da Gama, makes him a navigator over some of his ships, takes him to Portugal, and a few years later Yosef Adel dies. One new Christian who was beyond suspicion by the Portuguese was Dr. Garcia da Horta. He was the first fellow to do an intensive study of tropical medicines. As a matter of fact, the Portuguese were so impressed with Dr. Garcia da Horta that they granted him Bombay for a while. Mumbai, for those of you who are politically correct. And interestingly, by the way, in 1937, a B'nai Israel fellow by the name of Elijah Moses was the mayor of Mumbai. But back to Garcia da Horta, it was found out 15 years after his death that he in fact had been a closet Jew, keeping Judaism whenever he could, and therefore his body was exhumed, he was burnt, his ashes were pulverized, and were dumped out at sea, and his family was persecuted. But like in South America, where the lines were occasionally moving between the Portuguese and the Dutch, and the Jews were very happy to live under the Dutch conquered the Portuguese, and the Dutch East India Company is now in charge over the Jewish community, and for years the Jewish community of Cochin held a celebration on the 15th day of the month of Av in the summer, which was apparently the day that an emissary of the Jewish community of Holland showed up in India with crates full of Jewish ritual objects and Jewish ritual books. A Cochini synagogue has recently been moved to Israel, and wonderfully you can go to the synagogue in Jerusalem in the Israel Museum and you can pray in that synagogue. There is an old Jewish legend that has it that in the end of days, synagogues from around the world will fly to Israel, and it seems that that has actually taken place. This Cochini synagogue from Poland, from South America, from other places. There are 2 Renaissance synagogues from Italy that were recently brought over to Israel. So in fact, synagogues have come from all over the world to Israel. The nicest Cochini synagogue is still in Cochin. This is the Paradesi, meaning foreigner, was what the white Jews were called. The Paradesi synagogue. It had a beautiful clock tower. And one side had Roman numerals, another had Indian numerals, and another side, amazingly in India, had Hebrew numerals, the Aleph Bet. The floor was and is covered with hundreds of hand-painted unique tiles brought in from China, and the Torah scrolls were crowned with very beautiful crowns made of silver and gold, including a very beautiful crown donated by the British Colonel Macaulay in 1808, when his life was saved from an enraged Indian mob by a Cochini man with the classical Hindi name of Naftali Rottenberg. As we mentioned before, the entire community has made its way to Israel, and less than a handful of Jews remain in Cochin. But in Israel, they also had a problem. Not the same problem that the B'nai Israel had, a very different one. It seems that many of the Jews of Cochin had elephantiasis, and the authorities in Israel were concerned that that might cause an outbreak among other immigrants to Israel. So for a little while, when they arrived in 1950, they were kept quarantined. But it was then viewed safe to allow them to leave, and they moved to various parts of Israel, to a number of moshavim, communal living areas, including the Moshav Nevatim, where a great many of the people in Moshav Nevatim until this very day are from Cochin or are descended from the Jews of Cochin from southwest India. The third group that we will discuss of Jews in India is the Baghdadi Jewish community, a short-lived, recently established and small Jewish community, but important beyond their numbers and their age. In 1790, the first Baghdadi fellow arrived, not from Baghdad, but from Aleppo. a businessman, and we have to wonder why then the community is called the Baghdadi Jewish community. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But first, I'd like to let you know that they had probably the most beautiful synagogue in all of India, a large, gorgeous synagogue called Magen David, which was built in 1861. They had 36 Torah scrolls, which would be amazing for a synagogue in New York or in Jerusalem. But in India, to think that this community had 36 Torah scrolls, and they were all displayed on the holiday of Simchat Torah. In any event, in 1832, David Sassoon of Baghdad shows up, which is why they're called the Baghdadi Jewish community. The Sassoons were often referred to as the Rothschilds of the East, and David Sassoon was called Mayor Amschel Rothschild of the East. The Rothschilds were an important, very wealthy banking and business family, Jewish family in Europe, and the Sassoons were an important Sephardic business family in the Far East. David Sassoon had a great number of children, including 8 sons, all of whom went into the family business to one degree or another. He had sons going to Shanghai, to Hong Kong, and to other parts of the Far East. He had kids and grandkids who got involved in British politics. As well, he had descendants, and still has descendants, who are Torah scholars. His son Solomon was a Torah scholar, and amazingly, his son's wife Flora was a Torah scholar, to whom people would ask she'elot. They would ask questions relating to Jewish religious law. And Flora, whenever she would travel, made sure to have a minyan with her, a quorum of 10 men, so that she could pray even those prayers that require 10 men in order to be prayed. The Sassoons and other Baghdadi Jews were very important because they were tremendous philanthropists to Jewish and non-Jewish causes in India. They built schools, they built hospitals, they built orphanages. As a matter of fact, interestingly, David Sassoon's house is now a hospital in India. As well, through their business ventures, the Baghdadi Jews did wonderful things for the Indian economy. To give you one example, the Jacob Sassoon Mill, which was only one of the ventures of the Sassoon family, never mind of the entire Baghdadi community, the Jacob Sassoon Mill in 1916 employed over 15,000 Indians. But today the Baghdadi Jewish community is no more. Perhaps only 200 of them or so remain in India. The rest of the Baghdadi Jews have left India, some to Israel, some to other parts of the globe. A great many, as a matter of fact, the majority, have made their home in England, and some have made their way to the United States, where you can find a number of Baghdadi Indian Jews in the large Jewish communities of California and New York. The fourth and final of the Indian Jewish communities is the one that is the most controversial, and as well the one that is the most relevant, because they are the only one of the communities actively involved in Aliyah, in immigrating to Israel, and also to a degree in changing the character of the Jewish people as it stands today. And their story begins, aptly enough, with a relative of mine. I think many stories do. My grandmother has a first cousin, or at least had, he's no longer alive, passed away a few years ago at an old age in Jerusalem, named Rabbi Avraham Elia Sonnenschein. Born in Hungary, spent some time in Auschwitz, and then moved to Israel. In the early years of the state of Israel, he was involved in researching, guess what? He was involved in researching far-flung and exotic Jewish communities. And in the process of doing this, he decided he was going to focus on the 10 lost tribes, which we're going to be discussing at greater length in another talk. But for right now, just so you know, the 10 lost tribes are the tribes that were conquered by the Assyrians in the 8th century before the Common Era. But that's not my cousin's fault. Back to his research. He decided to search for the 10 lost tribes, and he believed, as did many medieval Jews, and as do a number of Jews today, but most do not, but he believed that there were millions of the descendants of the 10 lost tribes living somewhere in some far-flung and exotic place. And he tracked them down based on mystical reasonings, which personally I don't put nearly as much stock in, but based on somewhat mystical reasonings, as well as based on a certain amount of evidence. I don't think it's a form of evidence that academics would hold true to, but for example, any time that he found a society that shared a few words with the Hebrew language, or perhaps shared a few practices with Judaism or beliefs with Judaism, he automatically assumed that this shows they must be descended from the lost tribes. Of course, anybody and everybody familiar with Judaism recognizes that Judaism is a vast religion with a tremendous amount of literature behind it, and with a great amount of words in the language, and therefore it would be uncommon to find any people that do not have some similarities with Jewish people. In any event, the communities he was working on were those of India, Kashmir, Afghanistan, Japan, and a few others, and he tried to peddle his theories around Israel, but few people were interested until he was invited out to Nachalim by a young Rabbi Eliyahu Avichayil, who invited him out to speak to his students. It turns out that the person most impressed by Rabbi Sonnenschein's talk was Rabbi Avichayil himself, who decided to devote the rest of his life toward bringing back these lost tribes. And to that end, he has gone a tremendous distance. He created an organization called Amishav, My Nation Returns, and Rabbi Avichayil has been working with a number of peoples around the world in terms of trying to bring them back to Judaism, as well to bring them to Israel. Rabbi Avichayil is very Zionistic. The community perhaps that he was most interested in, as well, to give him some more credit than I'm about to, you should know the second president of the state of Israel, Yitzchak Ben Tzvi, writes about them as well and did a tremendous amount of research into this community, perhaps more than they deserved, but the community is the Patan, or the Pashtun. We all know and love them as the Taliban. Not necessarily only the Taliban, but a great many people in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Rabbi Avichayil, in fact, did not do very much good for PR of the Jewish people when he publicly advocated that we do Jewish outreach on the Taliban instead of waging a war against them. As it turns out, his sentiments were not shared by the majority of Jews or by the majority of Americans. In any event, he did not have much success with the Taliban, and it seems unlikely they're going to give up their penchant for stonings and beheadings and burqas for Judaism. But the group that he had a better success rate with was this community in India. Now, if you look at a map, you're going to be hard-pressed to find them in India because they are along the northeasternmost part of India, a small triangle surrounded entirely by other countries, including Nepal, Bhutan, Burma or Myanmar, China. As a matter of fact, it's only connected to India by a thin sliver of land that locals call the Chicken Neck. The regions that I'm referring to in India are those of Assam, Meghalaya, Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, and others, comprising about 5 to 7 million people. Now, those that Rabbi Avichayil, as well as a number of their local prophets, have convinced are Jews, those that do believe that they are Jewish, because the majority do not. The majority, in fact, practice Christianity. But those who believe that they are Jewish claim that they descend from Menashe. Menashe was the older son of Joseph, Joseph being the second to youngest son of Jacob. Of course, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, that Joseph. They believe they descend from Menashe because they have a mythical ancestor who perhaps existed, that they revere greatly, called Manamas or Manmasi. And therefore, when they were informed via missionaries about the Bible, and they studied the Bible, they, or perhaps the missionaries, or perhaps Jews, connected them with this Menashe. And therefore, these people, who are called alternatively the Shinlung or the Mizo, a number of other tribes, these people refer to themselves as the Bnei Menashe, the sons of Menashe. Now, there's a tremendous controversy going on in Israel about these people. On the one hand are those who say they're Jewish, great, bring them back. On the other side, there are those who say, are you crazy? There's about 5 to 7 million people who are entirely non-Jewish. Of course, they may have some Jewish genes, as we spoke of. Any people across the world may have some Jewish genes because so many Jews have assimilated out of the Jewish people. But at the end of the day, these people are ethnically identical to those in Burma and Myanmar, and the odds that they descend from Jews are ever so slight. There is no evidence, there is no real evidence at least, to suggest that they descend from Jews, that they are Jewish in any way. And the debate has made for strange bedfellows in support of the Bnei Menashe. For example, there are many who are very right-wing Israelis and right-wing Jews who say, look, those people who convert, because even Rabbi Avichayil concurs that they do have to convert if they want to be Jewish, those that have converted and made their way to Israel are wonderful Jews. They are wonderful Israeli citizens, and they are living even in dangerous territories. They are living in parts of the West Bank and Gaza to a large degree, which of course right-wing Israelis are very in favor of. And other supporters of the Bnei Menashe are those who are very postmodern, wishy-washy Jews. and they're uncomfortable with the idea of a Jewish people, and therefore they'd like to broaden the definition of the Jewish people. And the thought of finding some people who, quote-unquote, don't look Jewish, of course, it's a silly term, but the thought of finding some people who don't look Jewish, who look like Indian Orientals, very un-Jewish in fact, is very exciting to these people. And in their leftist ideology, they're excited by the prospect of calling these people Jews. Of course, on the other side are many responsible figures in Israeli immigration who say that there is a tremendous danger of millions of people who are not Jewish in any way, who have their own tribal civil wars going on, moving to Israel. So in favor of the Bnei Menashe, you have those on the right wing who would like to import more Jews to Israel so as to help the Jewish demographics, as well as to settle the West Bank and Gaza, as well as you have in support of the Bnei Menashe Jews with a very strong left-leaning tendency, and against accepting the Bnei Menashe as Jews are a great many people in immigration who are fearful of what it would do for the Jewish character. I can comment on this matter to a small degree, not so much because of my cousin's research on the matter, but more so because I've had the opportunity to meet a great many Bnei Menashe in Israel. A few hundred live in Israel, and a few thousand are living as Jews in India. I've met those that are in Israel, a great many of them. I've been to Bnei Menashe weddings, I've been to their homes, and a close friend of mine is the first rabbi from the Bnei Menashe community. And I can comment that even though I am very doubtful as to their Jewish claims, I've seen no real evidence to say that they're Jewish, in fact, and it seems that it's only people with a very strong vested interest for one reason or another who say that they're Jewish. They are model Jews and model Israeli citizens. If only all Jews were as sincere and as caring as these Bnei Menashe. On the other hand, I certainly understand the other side of the debate as well, and time will tell what will happen with the masses of these people still living in India, whether first of all they will have an interest in identifying as Jews, and secondly, if they do, how the Jewish people in Israel and outside the state of Israel will respond. As for those who have converted, obviously they are accepted by all Jews, because a convert is accepted as a complete Jew as much, and in a certain sense even more, than somebody who was born into the religion. And so we've discussed the Bnei Israel. Oh, by the way, I should mention that the people I mentioned in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and more so those in Kashmir actually, are occasionally called the Bani Israel, which you should not confuse with the Bnei Israel, whom we've discussed along the northwestern coast of India after they landed at Naugaon, the Gora Israel and Kala Israel, and then further down south, the Kochini Jews in the Kerala region. We have the black Jews, the brown Jews, and the white Jews. As well, we've discussed the Baghdadi Jews, only recently arrived and already recently left, and of small numbers, but of great importance. And finally, the Bnei Menashe, either returning to the fold of the Jewish people after a long and distant exile, or first now joining the peoplehood of Israel, the Jews of India.